"Drive on," the equerry said, and pointed his glove past the broken bridge to the white shoulder of the pass. "We do not stop here. Tell your sergeant to bring the column up." I was 26 that winter, a corporal of the King's road escort, and I had carried that order from the head of the column to the gate of the village with my horse blowing steam, and the snow already past her fetlocks. I found Sergeant Holt where I knew I would find him, at the post he had set himself, which was no post at all, only the place where the one road through the village narrowed between a fallen barn and a frozen well, the only place a wagon could pass or be stopped. He stood there in the full dress they had us wear even in that country, the dark coat and the tall bearskin gone gray with snow, his rifle at the order, his eyes forward on nothing, exactly as he had stood on the palace forecourt where I first served under him. Except there was no forecourt here. There was a half-dead village in a closing pass, and there was a wagon in the road in front of him that the column was about to leave behind. "Sergeant," I said, "Major Carden's order, we push for the summit before dark, we don't winter here." Holt did not turn his head. He never turned his head when you gave him a thing he meant to refuse. I would learn that about him before the night was out. He said, "Whose wagon is that, Corporal?" I looked at the wagon. I had ridden past it twice without seeing it, the way you ride past a great many things when a major is shouting at the head of a column and the light is going. It was an alms cart, a long, low country wagon under a sagging canvas, and the mule that should have drawn it was down in the traces with a broken leg, and a woman in a gray nursing habit was kneeling in the snow beside the mule with her hand on its neck, not because she could do anything for it, but because she would not let a creature die alone. And under the canvas, packed close out of the wind, were the children. I will tell you now, because the rest of this only matters if you understand it from the start. They were the sick children of a fever house from the valley below, the ones whose families could not keep them and whose parish could not feed them, being moved over the pass to a charity hospital on the far side before the snows closed the road for the winter. There were 19 of them. The oldest was perhaps 11, and the youngest could not yet walk, and they had been 3 days on that road, and the storm that the major was trying to outrun had already caught their wagon and killed their mule and pinned them in a village that had nothing left to give them. I did not know all of that in the first moment. I knew there were children under the canvas, because one of them had pulled the corner of it back to watch the soldiers, and his face was the gray-white of a boy who has been cold for a long time, and he was not crying, which is worse than crying, and he was looking straight at Sergeant Holt. "It's an alms cart, Sergeant," I said. "Sick ones from the valley, their mules down, the major knows. He says the village will see to them, and we are to push for the summit while the road's still open." "The village," Holt said, "is 12 hungry houses and an old priest, and they have already given these children their last grain, which is why the nurse came out to beg the column for a mule and a hand, and the major rode past her." He said it without heat, the way he said everything, but I heard the iron come up under it like a stone road under thin snow. There is no one on this side of the pass to see to them but us. If we drive on, we leave 19 children and 1 woman to a storm that is going to bury this road by midnight. That is what the order is, Corporal. Say it plainly so we both know what we are being told to do. I had not said it plainly even to myself. When he made me say it, I could not. I should tell you who we were escorting, because it is the whole engine of the thing and the major's whole reason. At the head of our column, in a closed sledge coach with a brazier and fur robes and 2 physicians, rode the young Prince Aldrich of the House of Marin, the king's second son, 16 years old, who had been a year in the southern country recovering from a fever of the lungs that had nearly killed him at 14, and who was being brought home at last, by the king's own command, before the winter closed the high road. Everything about our column was built around that boy and his lungs and the cold. We had the best surgeons in the realm and a coach like a warm room on runners and orders, written orders, that the prince was not to be exposed, not to be delayed, not to be made to breathe the bad air of any low fever place, and was to be over the pass and down into the warm valleys of the home country before the weather turned. Major Carden, who commanded the column, was a careful and a frightened man, and he was frightened of exactly one thing, which was bringing the king's second son home dead of a chill he had caught in some plague village in the mountains. So when his column came down into a snowbound hamlet at dusk and found it full of fever children from a charity house, Major Carden did the thing his fear told him to do. He ordered us to drive on and leave them, and he told himself, as frightened men do, that it was for the boy. I want to be fair to him. He was not a cruel man. He was a man with one fear so large that it had eaten all his other judgment, and the only reason he did not do a worse thing that night is that the gate of the village was held by Sergeant Holt. "Corporal," Holt said, "ride back to the major. Tell him the road forward is blocked." "The road's not blocked, Sergeant," I said. "The bridge is out, but the ford's passable," the scout said. "The road forward is blocked," Holt said again, and now at last he turned his head and looked at me, and I understood that he was not asking me to lie. He was telling me a true thing in the only words that would carry up a column to a frightened major. "There is a wagon down in the only road through, and a woman who will not leave it, and 19 children who cannot be moved without horses we have and they don't. Until that wagon is up and those children are warm, the road forward is blocked. That is not a refusal of the order, Corporal. That is the report of the man at the gate. Carry it." I sat my horse in the snow and I did not move, because I was 26 and I had been taught for 8 years that the order of a major is the order of the king, and Sergeant Holt was about to set himself against it with nothing in his hands but a rifle at the order and a true sentence. And I was afraid for him. I had seen men broke for less. I had seen a good corporal stripped and sent home in a cart for being slow to clear a road when a duke's carriage wanted it, and that was a duke's convenience, and this was the king's son and the king's written word, and the man defying it was a road sergeant with gray in his stubble who would have, at the very most, the village priest and a half-frozen nurse to stand with him. "Sergeant," I said, "they'll break you." For the first time that day something moved in his face that was almost a smile, and it was the grimmest thing I ever saw a man do with his mouth. "They can break the sergeant," he said. "Let's see if they can break the gate. Ride." So I rode. I want you to understand the country, because the country was the third party in everything that happened, and it took no side and gave no mercy and would have killed every one of us with equal patience. The village, they called it Cold Harbor, which is a bitter sort of joke for a place 1,000 feet up a frozen pass, sat in a fold near the top, the last shelter before the summit. By the time our column reached it, the wind had swung round to the north and was driving the snow flat across the road, and the light was the flat blue-gray light of a mountain dusk that comes down like a lid. Major Carden's scouts had told him the truth. The summit was still passable just if we went hard and went now, and they had also told him, though he did not want to hear it, that no man and no horse would be going over it after full dark in the storm coming up the valley behind us. We had perhaps 2 hours of failing light. To take the children with us, we would have to harness our spare horses to their wagon, warm them, settle them, and bring a long, slow alms cart full of sick infants up a switchback road into a north wind, which we could not do in 2 hours, and which would mean wintering in Cold Harbor, which the prince's orders forbade. That was the box. That was the whole cruel arithmetic of it, and I am not going to pretend it was a simple one. If we stopped, we kept 19 poor children alive, and we risked the king's son to the cold and the bad air of a fever village, against the king's written word. If we drove on, we obeyed the king and we saved the prince his chill, and we left 19 children and none to be buried in the snow by morning. Major Carden had looked at that box and chosen the king's son. Sergeant Holt was about to look at the same box and choose differently, and the thing I have spent 30 years trying to make young soldiers understand is that Holt did not choose the children over the prince. He chose, as he told me later in 3 words by a fire I will come to, the whole over the half. But I am ahead of myself. I found Major Carden at the head of the halted column, up on his big gray horse with his collar turned against the wind and his face the color of the snow. The coach with the prince in it had come up behind him and stopped, its runners creaking, the breath of its team standing in the cold like smoke. The physicians had put their heads out and pulled them back in. The whole long line of us, escort baggage, the spare horses, the coach, stood stopped on the road below the village in the failing light, waiting for the corporal who had been sent to clear the gate to come back and say it was cleared. "Well," the major said, "is the road open?" "Sir," I said, "the road forward is blocked." It was the hardest sentence I ever spoke, and I spoke it in Holt's exact words because I did not trust my own. "There's a wagon down and the only way through the village, an alms cart, the mules killed. There are children in it, sir, sick ones from the valley, 19 of them, and a nurse who won't leave them, and there's no clearing the road forward until the wagon's moved, and the wagon can't be moved without our horses." "Then take a file of men and throw the wagon in the ditch," the major said. "Put the children in the houses. The village will keep them till spring." "The village has nothing, sir," I said. "Sergeant Holt says." "I did not ask what Sergeant Holt says," Major Carden said, and his voice cracked up an octave on the sergeant's name, and I heard in that crack that he already knew. He already knew what was waiting for him at the gate. He had ridden past the nurse himself. He had seen the gray faces under the canvas. He had given the order to drive on knowing exactly what he was leaving, and now a corporal had come back and made him hear it said out loud in front of his column, and the part of him that was still a soldier and not only a frightened man knew that the road sergeant at the gate was going to make him hear it again. "Corporal, the prince of this realm is in that coach, 1 year out of a sickbed, and behind us is a storm that will close this pass for the winter. My orders are signed by the king's own hand. We do not winter in a fever village. Now you will go back and tell Sergeant Holt to clear the road, and if he will not clear it, I will come and clear it myself, and I will clear him with it. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," I said. And I turned my horse, and I rode back up to the gate to tell Sergeant Holt that the major was coming to break him. And the snow came down harder and the light went a shade lower, and somewhere under the canvas a child began, very quietly, to cough. Holt was where I had left him. He had not moved a boot. But in the little time I had been gone he had done the only thing a man can do who means to hold a line he cannot hold alone, which is he had begun, quietly, to build the line. The village priest was beside him now, an old man in a cassock with a horse blanket over his shoulders, and 2 of the escort troopers, Daw and young Ennis, the ones who had been at the rear of the column and nearest the village when it halted, had drifted up to the gate without orders, and were standing a little behind the sergeant with their reins in their hands, the way men stand when they have not yet decided to disobey, but have already decided they cannot ride away. And the nurse had risen from the dead mule and come to stand at Holt's shoulder, a small, hard-faced woman of 40 with her habit white with snow, and she was not begging any more. She had stopped begging the moment a soldier stood still in her road and asked her whose wagon it was. She stood now like a woman who has found, against all her expectation, one man who is not going to ride past and means to stand by him whatever it costs. "The major's coming up, Sergeant," I said. "He says clear the road or he clears you with it." "I heard the shape of it from here," Holt said. "Daw, Ennis, you don't have to be at this gate. Go back to the column. No man will think the worse of you, and I'll say I sent you." "You didn't send us, Sergeant," Daw said. "No," Holt said, "I didn't," and he let them stay. Then Major Carden came up the road through the snow with 4 mounted men behind him, and the column's lanterns behind them, and he reined in before the gate and looked down at the small impossible thing in his way. A road sergeant at the order, a priest, a nun, 2 troopers and 1 ashamed corporal, standing between the king's column and the open road. I have been in battles since that were less frightening to me than the next 4 minutes, because in a battle no one asks you to choose. "Sergeant Holt," the major said, "you will stand aside and you will clear this road." "Sir," said Holt, "and here is the thing I have never forgotten, the thing I have told every recruit who ever stood a hard post under me. He did not argue. He did not plead the children. He did not raise his voice or his rifle or his eyes. He reported, 'There is an alms cart down in the only road through this village, with a broken mule and 19 sick children and 1 nurse aboard. The road forward cannot be cleared without our horses to draw the wagon. If the column drives on now, the children and the nurse will not survive the night, because there is no shelter and no food in this village to keep them and no other relief behind us on this road. That is the state of the gate, sir. I am reporting it so that the order to drive on is given by a man who knows what it does.'" "I know what it does, Sergeant," the major said, and his voice was tight. "I gave it knowing. The prince of this realm—" "The prince of this realm," Holt said, "is 16 years old and the son of a king, and I have served his house since before he was born, and I will tell you plainly, sir, as one soldier of that house to another, that if we leave 19 of the king's poorest children dead in the snow to bring his son home an hour quicker, we will not be bringing home anything the king would thank us for. We will be bringing home a boy and burying the realm he is meant to rule." He paused. The snow came down between them. "I will not clear this road over those children, sir. You may relieve me. You may break me on the column's books tomorrow, and I will not say one word against it. But you will have to bring up another man to stand in this gate and give the order to drive on himself, because I will not give it. And I do not think, sir, when it comes to it, that you will be able to find one who will." It was the longest speech I ever heard Sergeant Holt make, and he made it in a level voice with his eyes forward, and when it was done he said nothing more. He simply stood. The stillness was the argument. That is the whole secret of the man and of the coat, and I did not understand it until that night. A man who will not move and has chosen rightly, and will take whatever comes for it without flinching. There is nothing a frightened man can do against him but become him or ride over him, and most men, asked to ride over a thing like that, find they cannot. Major Carden sat his gray horse in the snow and looked at the sergeant for a long time. The wind hauled at his coat. Behind him, his 4 men sat very still, and I knew I could feel it the way you feel weather changing, that not one of those 4 would lay a hand on Holt if the major ordered it. The order had reached the edge of what an order can carry, which is the edge of what the men who must obey it believe is right, and it had stopped there in the gate against one still man. "You are relieved, Sergeant," the major said at last, and his voice had gone strange. "Stand away from the gate." Holt took 1 pace back from the road, not a side back. He grounded his rifle. He had been relieved. He obeyed the relief. He stood now a private man in the snow with no post and no authority, exactly as he had said he would. And the road was open. The wagon was still down in it, the mule still dead in the traces, the children still under the canvas, but the sergeant was relieved and stood away, and the major had only to order a file of men to heave the cart into the ditch, and the column could drive on through. "Corporal," the major said to me, "take 6 men. Clear the wagon." And I sat my horse, and I looked at the open gate, and the relieved sergeant standing bareheaded now in the snow, because he had taken off the bearskin. I think so the children could see his face, and I looked at the boy under the canvas who had not stopped watching us, and I found that I was Sergeant Holt's man more than I was the major's, and had been since the moment he made me say the order out loud. "No, sir," I said. I have never been more frightened of my own voice, but it was said. "I'll not clear it, sir," I said. "I'm sorry, sir, court-martial me with him, but I'll not throw those children in the ditch to bring the prince home an hour quicker. I'll not do it." "Nor I, sir," said Daw. "Nor I," said Innes, who was 18 and white as the snow, and said it anyway. And then the old priest, who had not spoken, stepped out into the middle of the open road, and stood beside the relieved sergeant and the dead mule with his hands folded, an unarmed old man in a horse blanket, and said, "You will have to drive the column over me as well, Major, for I will not stand aside from my own road while children are left to die on it." And the nurse came and stood beside the priest. And there we were, a relieved sergeant, a priest, a nun, 3 troopers, and a corporal, standing in the open gate the major had just won, and not one of us would clear it. He had broken the sergeant, and the gate had not opened. It had grown. Major Carden looked at us, and something went out of his face, and something else came into it that I think was the man he had been before the fear ate him. And before he could speak, before any of us could speak, the door of the prince's coach, far down the column, opened, and a thin figure in a fur robe climbed down into the snow against the shouted protests of 2 physicians, and began to walk up the road toward the gate. He was a slight boy, the prince, taller than I expected and thinner, with the long pale look of someone who has spent a year being kept indoors out of the air. He came up the road slowly, because the snow was deep, and his physicians had him by both arms trying to turn him back, and he shook them off without anger, the way you shake off a thing you have shaken off 100 times, and he came on. The whole column watched him come. When he reached the gate he was breathing hard, and one of the physicians was saying, "Highness, the air here, the fever in the wagon, I beg you," and the prince said, not to the physician but to the major in a voice that was younger than his words, "Major Carden, what is being argued at this gate?" Major Carden took off his hat to the boy. "Highness, there is a wagon of sick children blocking the road. I have given orders to clear it so the column may go on before the pass closes, as the king your father commanded, that you be brought home before the snows and not exposed to any fever. The sergeant has refused the order. The matter is being resolved." He said it stiffly in the official voice, but I saw his eyes go to Holt, and I saw that even as he said it he was waiting, though I do not think he knew it himself, for the boy to settle the thing his own fear could not. The prince looked at the wagon. He looked at the dead mule, and the kneeling nurse's tracks in the snow and the corner of canvas pulled back, and the boy under it watching him, the gray-faced boy, who was perhaps a year or 2 younger than the prince and 1,000 leagues below him in every earthly thing, and who looked at the king's son with no fear at all, only the flat patient waiting of the very cold. And the Prince of Marin stood a moment in the snow and looked at that other boy, and something passed between them that I will not pretend to have understood, except that the prince had been 14 and near death in a sickbed not 2 years before, and I think he knew, looking at the cold child, exactly how thin the wall is between the boy in the fur robe and the boy under the canvas, and exactly who decides on which side of it you are born. "My father commanded that I be brought home," the prince said slowly, "before the snows and not exposed to fever. Is that the order, Major?" "It is, Highness." "Then I will tell you what my father would say if he stood in the snow where I stand, because I have heard him say it." The boy's voice was not loud, but it carried, the way Holt's had, the way the truth carries on a still cold night. He would say that he did not send his son a year to the south to learn to ride and to fence and to bow, but to learn what a king is for. And he would say that a king is not for being carried warm over a pass while his children freeze in the road below him. That is not what the crown is. I have spent a year learning it. I am not going to forget it in the first hour I am asked to use it. He turned from the major and looked at the relieved sergeant standing bareheaded in the snow. "Sergeant, you refused the order to leave them." "I did, Highness," said Holt. "On whose authority?" And Holt said the thing that I have had carved since on the stone over his grave, because it is the truest sentence I ever heard a soldier say. "On the authority of the coat, Highness. The coat is for standing between your house and the things that would shame it. I could not stand here and let it be shamed." The prince looked at him for a long moment. Then he did a thing that no one had told him to do, and that broke every line of protocol his physicians had been shouting at him about, and that I have seen bring grown soldiers to tears in the telling 30 years after. The king's second son, in the snow, before the whole halted column, took the edge of his fur robe in his hands and pulled it off his own shoulders, and carried it to the wagon, and laid it over the gray-faced boy under the canvas. Then he straightened, in his thin coat in the north wind, breathing the air his physicians had crossed a kingdom to keep him from, and he said to Major Carden, loudly enough for the column to hear, "We do not drive on. We do not winter here either idle while they suffer. We are going to get these children over the pass alive, and I am going with them, and you, Major, are going to command it, because I am told there is no better man in the realm for getting a column over a mountain, and tonight I require exactly that man. Now stop being afraid for me. I have been afraid for myself for 2 years, and I am done with it. What do we do first? I have seen a great many things turn in my life. I have never seen anything turn the way Major Carden turned in that moment. The fear went out of him like water out of a tipped bucket, all at once, and the soldier came up to fill the place it left, and he became, in the space of one breath, the man the realm had given that column to in the first place. Because his fear had been a true thing, it had only been pointed at the wrong target. He had been afraid of failing the king. The boy had just shown him that the way to fail the king was to drive on, and the way to keep faith was the hard road. And the moment Major Carden understood that, every scrap of the care and dread that had nearly made him leave the children turned around and became the most ferocious competence I ever served under. "Highness," he said, "back in the coach with the brazier, or I cannot answer for you to the king, and that is not fear, that is sense, and you'll grant me sense. Sergeant Holt, you are no longer relieved. You have the gate and the wagon. Corporal, to me, the spare team, harnessed to the alms cart now. Daw Ennies, every man not holding a horse into the village to wake every house and build every fire. Surgeons to the children first, the prince second, and tell them I said so. We have 2 hours of bad light and a night of worse, and we are going to spend them keeping 19 children and a king's son alive on the same road, and by God we are going to do both. Move." And the realm rallied. That is the only word for what happened in Cold Harbor that night, and I have chosen it carefully, because it was not one man's mercy and it was not a miracle. It was the whole machine of a kingdom, which had nearly been turned to driving past 19 children in the snow, swung round in a single hour to saving them. And once it swung, there was nothing in that pass that could stand against it. We harnessed the column's strongest spare team to the alms cart and drew it up out of the road and into the lee of the church. We woke the 12 houses of the village, and the 12 houses, who had given their last grain already and thought they had nothing left to give, found, the way the poor always find, that there is always a little more, a banked fire, a corner out of the wind, a hand. The surgeons who had crossed a kingdom to keep one boy alive went down on their knees in the straw of a country church over 19 others, and did the work they were the best in the realm at doing, and were better men for it before morning. The escort that had been a ceremonial show, the dark coats, the bearskins, the polish, became, in an hour, exactly what an escort is supposed to be underneath the show. 40 disciplined men who could be pointed at a hard thing in the dark and would do it without breaking. We carried the children one at a time into the church and laid them by the fire, and the nurse went down the row of them naming each one to the surgeons, because she knew them all, every name, and would not let one be a stranger. And here is the part the major had been right to fear and wrong to flee. The storm did come up the valley. It closed the road behind us by full dark, exactly as the scouts had said, and it would have buried the alms cart and everyone in it where it stood in the gate. But it did not close the road ahead of us, not at once. The summit held passable through the night, just in the lee of the saddle, and Major Carden, who knew that country the way Holt knew a gate, made the hard calculation the right way this time. He did not try to run the whole heavy column over the summit in the storm. He waited for the dark to steady, and then in the small hours, when the wind dropped the way it sometimes does before dawn in the high country, he took us over. We went over the pass in the blue dark before dawn, the whole of us, the escort, the village's own 2 carts that they would not be left behind from, the alms wagon warm now and full of breathing children, and the prince's coach in the middle of the column instead of at the head of it, which is where I think it should always have been. The summit was a white knife edge under a sky just going gray, and the cold up there was the worst cold I have ever felt, the kind that is a sound as much as a feeling, and we got every soul over it. Down the far side the road dropped fast into the home country, and the home country was below the snow line, and there were lights down there, real lights, the lights of the first warm valley, and a charity hospital with its doors open, and its fires lit because a rider Major Carden had sent ahead the night before had told them what was coming up the road. We lost no one. I want that said as plainly as Holt would have said it. 19 children went into the snow at Cold Harbor, and 19 children came down the far side alive, and the king's son came down alive with them, breathing the cold air all the way and the better. His surgeons swore afterward to their own surprise for the using of his lungs. The mule we buried. The village we left with the column's own stores, every sack we could spare, because the prince ordered it and the major saw it loaded himself. And the gray-faced boy who had watched us from under the canvas. His name was Call, and he is a grown man now with a forge of his own in that same valley. And every year on the night it happened he lights a lamp in his window and keeps it burning till dawn, for the man who would not leave him in the snow. But I have not told you about the fire and the 3 words, and I said that I would, so I will, because that is the part of the night that made me the soldier I became, and the part I have spent 30 years trying to hand on. It was in the small hours, in the church, in the long wait before the wind dropped enough to take us over. The children were warm and the surgeons had done what could be done, and there was nothing left but to wait. And Sergeant Holt and I sat on the church step with our backs to the door and the heat of the fires behind us and the cold of the mountain in front. And he had the bearskin off and his gray head bare, and he looked, for the first time since I had known him, like a tired old man instead of a wall. I had questions in me like a fever. I was 26, and I had just refused a major's order and stood a court-martial gate beside a sergeant who had thrown his whole career into the snow. And I needed to know. I needed it the way you need air, that we had been right. Because if we had been wrong, I had broken my whole life for nothing, and very nearly killed a prince besides. Sergeant, I said, if the prince had taken the fever, if we'd brought him home dead, would it have been worth it? 19 of them against the king's son. Tell me plainly, was it worth the risk? And Holt was quiet for a while, looking at the snow, and then he said the 3 words, and I have never improved on them, though I have tried for 30 years. The whole, not the half. I waited. He saw I did not understand, and he was patient with me, the way he was always patient with a man who was trying. The major did his sums wrong, Corporal, he said. He thought the choice was the prince against the children, 1 boy worth more than 19 or 19 worth more than 1, and either way you're weighing souls on a grosser scale, and there's no good answer on that scale. But that was never the choice. The choice was, do we save the prince by becoming the kind of realm that drives past freezing children, or do we save the prince and the children both, and stay the kind of realm worth his being king of? He thought he was protecting the boy. He was about to hand him a kingdom with a rotten floor and call it a gift. He turned the bearskin over in his hands. You don't keep a king's house by keeping the king warm. You keep it by keeping its word. And the word under all the others is that we do not leave the helpless behind to save ourselves the trouble. The day we leave them, there's nothing left worth guarding. We'd be polishing the buttons on a corpse. But the risk to the prince was real, I said. The risk was real, Holt agreed. And we carried it, and we managed it, and we got him over alive, because managing a real risk for a right reason is the whole trade, Corporal. That's what the major remembered the minute the boy reminded him. The coward's lie is that you have to choose between the people you love and the thing that's right. You almost never do. Almost always there's a hard road that keeps them both, and the only thing standing between you and that road is that it's hard, and you're tired, and someone's shouting at you to drive on. The gate's not there to make the choice for you. It's there to make you stand still long enough to see that the easy answer was a lie. I have thought about that on a great many nights since, on a great many hard posts, with a great many frightened men shouting at me to drive on. I have never found it to be untrue. In the morning, down in the warm valley, the matter went where such matters go, up. Major Carden, to his lasting honor, made the report himself, and he made it straight. That he had given the order to abandon the alms cart, that the order had been a wrong one born of his fear for the prince, and that it had been refused at the gate by Sergeant Holt and by the men who stood with him, and that the refusal had been right, and had saved 19 children and shamed no one but himself, and that he had been brought back to his own duty by the prince and by the sergeant, and asked that the record show it. A man who will write that report about himself is a better man than one who never needed to, and I came in time to honor Carden more than I honored almost anyone, because I had watched him be afraid and watched him stop, which is the harder of the two by far. The king heard it all. I expected, with my heart in my mouth, a reckoning, a quiet stripping of ranks done out of the public eye, the realm's machinery closing softly over the men who had defied an order signed by the king's own hand. That is not what came. What came 3 weeks later was a single line added to the standing orders of the king's road escort in the king's own hand, and it is in the orders still, and every man who takes that coat has read it, and it says, "No order shall require the escort of this house to abandon the helpless upon the road. The man who refuses such an order keeps faith, and the house will stand behind him." They call it Holt's line. The sergeant himself never called it anything. When a young recruit once asked him about it, proud to be serving under the man it was written for, Holt said only, "It oughtn't to have needed writing down, but it's a comfort that it's there for the night. A man's too tired to remember it on his own." Sergeant Holt served 11 more years and was never promoted past sergeant, partly because he refused it twice and partly, I think, because a man who will defy a major in a snowstorm is not a comfortable thing to make an officer of, and the realm in its wisdom kept him exactly where he was most himself, which was a road and a gate and a wagon to wave through or to stop. I made sergeant under him and captain after him, and I have stood a great many gates of my own, and at every one, when the order came up the road to drive on and leave behind something that should not be left, I have made the man giving it say it out loud, and I have watched, more often than not, the order stop in his own mouth. He died on a road, as it happened, which I think he'd have chosen, an old man by then, walking the column on foot because he never would ride when the men were walking, and his heart simply stopped him in the middle of a march, between a fallen barn and a frozen well of another village in another pass, which is a thing I have never been able to think about without a tightness in my chest. We buried him under the words he said in the church, the ones about the coat, and beneath them the date of Cold Harbor and nothing else, because nothing else was needed. The prince became the king in time, a good one, the best in living memory, the older men say, and the thing they say of him most is that he never in 40 years drove past anyone on any road, that he stopped his own progress once for an hour to ride a turned hay cart and free the old man pinned under it, in his good clothes, in front of foreign ambassadors, and waved off their astonishment with a remark that those who heard it never forgot. They asked him where a king had learned to stop for a stranger in a ditch, and he said, the story goes, that he had learned it one night in a closing pass, from a sergeant who would not move, when he was 16 and ashamed of how nearly he had been carried warm past 19 children in the snow. That is the whole of it. People hear the story now and they think it is about a brave guard who defied an order, and it is, but that is the smallest part. The largest part is the thing Holt knew on the church step and the boy understood in the gate, that a kingdom is not measured by how well it carries its prince, but by what it will not leave behind to carry him faster, and that the whole weight of it, the crown and the law and the long word of a house, can come down in the end to one tired man at a gate in the snow, deciding whether to be the kind of man who drives on. He was not. They were not any of us in the end, and 19 lamps in a forge in a far valley are lit against the dark every year for it, and will be, I think, long after the last of us who stood that gate is gone. We did not save them because we were brave. We saved them because one man stood still in the road until the rest of us remembered who we were. That is what the coat is for. That is the only thing it was ever for. And on the nights it is hardest to remember, the cold nights, the tired nights, the nights some frightened good man is shouting at you to drive on and leave the small ones behind. I have found there is no better thing a soldier can do than to plant his boots and ground his rifle and report the road plainly and refuse to move, and let them break the sergeant if they must, and see, as I once saw, whether they can break the gate. They could not break it that night. They have not broken it yet.